Hola, yo soy Horacio Pérez y esto es Investigando la Investigación, un podcast donde investigamos cómo investigan los investigadores, tanto en la academia, industria, independientes. Todo ello mediante entrevistas y debates abiertos, técnicas y estrategias para mejorar todas las partes del proceso investigador y, no menos importante, opiniones abiertas que espero llamen tu curiosidad y te hagan también reflexionar. Hola, hoy te traigo un nuevo episodio de entrevistas. En este caso, entrevistas asíncronas. Ya tenemos varios episodios este año y estas entrevistas asíncronas se realizan en nuestra comunidad de investigadores en WhatsApp, a la cual, si te interesa, puedes acceder gratuitamente a través de horacio-ps.com/comunidad. El funcionamiento, muy brevemente, es que la comunicación se da de manera asíncrona, donde tenemos diversos grupos con diferentes temáticas. Cada investigador comienza una conversación mediante notas de voz y los demás pueden seguirle y al final se forma una conversación. Si quieres saber los detalles, puedes irte al episodio número 205 del podcast, donde lo comento con total detalle. Bueno, pues un nuevo episodio. La nueva característica que tiene este episodio de hoy es que está hecho en inglés. Hoy lo publico, pero la entrevista ha sido realizada de manera síncrona durante los meses de segunda mitad de febrero, marzo y primera mitad de abril. ¿Vale? Ha sido más o menos como una correspondencia de cartas, pero una correspondencia de audios. Entonces, en este episodio he entrevistado a Anushia Inthiran. No sé si lo he dicho bien, pero ella es profesora e investigadora en el Departamento de Contabilidad y de Sistema de Información de la Universidad de Canterbury en la ciudad de Christchurch, en Nueva Zelanda. Y se dedica a una investigación súper interesante en varios temas que mezclan elementos tanto de la psicología, de la experiencia de usuario y de la informática. Entonces, este episodio se ha centrado al principio en un trabajo que ella realizó y publicó y que os pondré el enlace en las notas del programa, donde ella analizaba cómo diversos usuarios reflejaban sus experiencias a la hora de interaccionar en un sitio web donde se daban o tenían lugar ciertas transacciones electrónicas, y ella estudiaba cuándo o cuándo no los usuarios confiaban en ese sitio web. Un trabajo súper interesante. Entonces, bueno, nada más, os lo dejo para que lo escuchéis, y hemos tratado no solo ese trabajo, sino también cómo ha sido su investigación, su opinión del sistema de investigación, aplicación a convocatorias de proyectos, etcétera. Bueno, pues nada más, sin más dilación, os dejo con la entrevista. Vamos a por ello, donde primero se presenta Anushia y luego ya viene todas las preguntas y la conversación y debate, que ha sido muy interesante. Vamos a por ello.
Hello everyone, my name is Anushia. I am an academic at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand. Thank you for inviting me to join this group and to participate in your podcast. My research areas generally focus on information retrieval and online health information searching. I'm also interested in looking at user interface, human-computer interaction issues, and usability issues on health portals and health websites. More recently, I have ventured into the area of human-computer interaction and psychology, because I was interested to see the connection between what people do and what they're thinking about, and how we can understand human information behavior and human interaction a little bit better. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to introduce myself. I'm happy to meet all of you.
Thanks a lot, Anushia, for the introduction. Can you quickly tell us what are the main problems nowadays regarding human-computer interactions?
Thank you for your question, Horatio. I think one problem that we now face in the discipline of human computer interaction is that we ignore the users who are going to use our system or our website. We need to start paying attention to this concept called co-design, where the designer and the user or potential user work together to design an interface or the look and feel of a website. The second problem that we have in this discipline is that human computer interaction is always an afterthought. So we build systems and we build websites, but we don't take into account what the user thinks about the interface or wants to have on an interface. We pay a lot of attention to system requirements, what we want the system to do and what we don't want the system to do. But the look and feel of the system is always ignored, or usually attention is only paid to the look and feel of the system or the interface of the system after a system has been rolled out or after a website has gone live.
Is co-design somehow similar to the lean startup methodology that Eric Ries manifested kind of 10 years ago in his famous book, and which a lot of software companies and startups are using nowadays in order to design software and taking into account first what users seem to want or like?
Yes, certainly similarities between lean methodology and co-design. So with co-design, we use prototypes, and each prototype also undergoes several levels of iterations. So the iteration process is quite important because that is when you show a user a prototype and you collect feedback from the user about the prototype. So what colors do you like on the prototype? Do they understand the navigation structure of a page? Would they be able to foresee what clicking on a particular button would do, or where clicking on a particular link would take them to? So the whole idea of a good design is you do not want the user to think, because the moment you show a user a page or you provide a new application to the user, and if the user then has to take time to stop and think about how this user is now going to use the prototype, that's when the designer has probably violated a golden rule of a good human-computer interaction design.
And could you please give us some specific example where you apply this or a real-world scenario application in order to understand it better?
So prototyping is when we provide users with a visual representation of what the actual completed system would look like. There are three levels of prototyping: low level, medium level, and high level. We always start with the low level ones. We develop something called wireframes. So the designers would draw with pencil and paper, provide users with a skeletal view of what screens would look like. We then show users these wireframes and we obtain feedback. So we might ask users questions like, do you understand the images that you see on the screen? Are you able to follow the information flow or the architecture of what the screen looks like? And then depending on feedback, we will collect that and then go back and revise these wireframes, show them version 2 to the user, and then obtain feedback again. Now, once the designer is satisfied that he's got things right, he or she has got things right with the wireframes, the designer then moves on to medium level prototyping or medium level fidelity prototyping. This is where color is added, more functionality is added onto screens. Buttons are added onto screens, animation may be added onto screens. And then the user is shown these medium fidelity prototyping. Now the user gets to see the transition from wireframes up to medium level fidelity prototyping. And the screen design now becomes richer. The user now gets to actually see information flow. The user gets to understand what clicking buttons actually do. The user starts to understand the information flow from one page to the next. The user may then start providing feedback to the designer. So for example, a user may say, I don't really like the colors that I'm looking at. It doesn't really reflect our company logo or the branding of a particular organization. Sometimes the user may say, perhaps there's a need to rearrange the content. And one popular concept is where we have a saying called follow top of the page or top of a newspaper, for example. So similar to a newspaper where you would have breaking news right on top of a newspaper, we would also want to provide information that's most important to the user on top of a page and then less important information towards the bottom of the page. When we get to high fidelity prototyping, the system is almost complete. The user can expect to receive a complete system that looks very similar to high fidelity prototyping. So what we have done across the 3 stages of prototyping is always get the user involved, always obtain feedback from the user. And when we obtain feedback, we iterate the designs, we change the designs to fit the comments that we receive from the users. So eventually, a designer is now developing a system that will be liked by the user, will be used by the user. We don't want to develop systems and then deliver these systems to the user, and then the user says, well, this is not really what we wanted, or the user might say, this is not what we expected. So when you leave the user in the dark, and when the designer works in isolation, the designer is now going to design a system which he thinks or he or she thinks will work well. But that's not the whole point of human-computer interaction, because the designer is not going to be the user of the system. The real users are the people working in organizations or people like us when we arrive on websites. So when we get the user involved, when we do the different stages of prototyping, when we iterate the prototyping, we're more likely to get buy-in for the users. The users are more likely to use the system. The user is more likely to be satisfied with the system. And this increases the productivity from the designer.
Thanks. Now it is more clear. Of course, now we understand the project really well. Okay, now the question I have is the following. It is perhaps hard to formulate, but let's start from somewhere. Okay. I don't understand with the information that we have now if the research that you perform are kind of fundamental research in which you study this process and then you publish papers and perhaps methodologies. You show this information and papers in conference, or if you kind of work directly with some companies and then this is applied research, or if there is even technology transfer, meaning that you help companies to develop better software regarding user-computer interfaces. So if you could tell us a little bit about this. Thanks.
This is a great question. So let me give you some background as to why we started doing this research study. The first author on the paper, Chen Shi, she has an undergraduate degree in psychology and a master's degree in information systems. When she was doing her master's degree, she wanted to bring the two fields together, psychology and information systems. And as part of her study, she learned that there is a strong relationship between sociology and information systems, and psychology and information systems. And so she wanted to apply this knowledge she had, and she wanted to get visible results by doing a user study. So what we set out to do here is we wanted to investigate if different personality types gravitate towards certain design elements on a page, because those design elements instill trust in a user. And we asked this question because as of today, the greatest barrier to someone performing electronic commerce transaction is because of trust. Either they don't trust the organization, or they don't trust that the transaction will go through, or they may be afraid of being scammed by online e-commerce providers. So we asked participants a very simple questionnaire to put them into different psychological traits. And when we did that, we showed them different elements on an interface that you would find on a typical e-commerce site. So for example, if you see a shopping cart, does that instill trust? If you see a logo or branding, does that instill trust? If you have an about me page, or you get to see who are the employees of the company, does that instill trust? And so that's how we set out to do this study, and the results in the paper are clear to show that people of certain psychological traits look at some elements, human-computer interaction elements on a page, and that provides them with a greater level of trust, meaning that they are more likely to perform an e-commerce transaction. Now, when we set out to do this study, it started out as a fundamental research. We just wanted to see if there were design elements that suit different psychological traits, people belonging to different psychological groups. But what we've realized now is that companies are quite interested in our results. But in order for them to implement what we recommend, or technology transfer, as you call it, that would require fundamental change in the way e-commerce websites are built. Because one of our recommendations is that when somebody arrives at an e-commerce page, you would want them to fill up a quick questionnaire so that you now know what psychological trait that person belongs to. And once we know what the psychological trait is, we might alter the interface, personalize to fit the user's psychological traits, so that the user now sees more elements on the page that makes this user now trust this web page. So that will mean, when we arrive on e-commerce page in the near future, we might need to fill up a five questionnaire for the background engine to know what our psychological trait is, and then modify or personalize that page to suit our psychological trait, so that we are now likely to trust that website and perform and perhaps make a transaction on that website. So I hope I've answered that question well.
Hey, thanks a lot. The answer is very clear and it's very interesting. So now I wanted to ask you, probably, I guess, if you kind of ask users to fill out these surveys, probably they will not do it, from my experience, because we have some similar system in some web servers that we have developed. Those are for computational chemistry, but the idea is somehow similar, because we want the users to fill out the survey in order to understand which aspects or which functionalities we need to improve, not the user interface exactly, but the functionality. So we share that idea of user interaction. But my point is, sometimes they will not be interested in filling out the survey, so perhaps one could analyze, I don't know if this can be useful or not, but for instance, the way users move the mouse pointer over the screen, the velocity with which they interact with the screen or the buttons, because I guess such things can be tracked in some using some tools, some of these heat maps and so on. So what I mean is, if that kind of classification of the user personality can somehow be approximated in an automatic fashion. Do you know something about this?
Another great question from you, Horacio. You're giving me more and more ideas for future research in terms of HCI and psychology. So I don't know anything about mouse pointers and tracking of the mouse with velocity. I'm not aware, neither am I sure if there are already research studies that use that and link that back to human-computer interaction. But certainly with eye tracking technology, heat maps would definitely work well with human-computer interaction, and also the use of neurological devices like the EEG, so the electroencephalogram, is a device that you put on your head which keeps track of brain waves, and it's able to provide information as to how the user is feeling, whether the user is happy looking at the page or irritated or frustrated. So I have done some research studies with the eye tracker with older adults. It's a very small study, very initial stage, where we provided users with an online health webpage, and we gave users 5 seconds to look at that page, and we collected eye tracking data with heat maps. And that small research study told us that with older adults, so over 60 years of age, they don't pay attention to the top left and top right parts of the screen. And surprisingly, when you give text along with image, it is the text that is viewed most often and less attention is paid on the image. So I think if we now relate this to psychology, I think it would be very interesting for us to use the EEG device to collect brain waves to tell us what is going on in a user's brain, what is this person thinking about or feeling when the person arrives at the web page, and perhaps accompany that with data from mouse tracking, and then we would definitely get plenty of rich information, and it would tell us, real information about how a user or what a user is thinking about an interface, where on the page is attention paid to, where on a page is ignored, for example. So that certainly gives new opportunity for research. Unfortunately, I myself have not done any research studies with the EEG device. Neither do I understand the data from EEG. I've seen what the data looks like. It's just lots of brain waves, but it would really take a neuroscientist to come in to help me look at, if I were to actually do this research study, definitely the neuroscientist to come in to see and understand, or help me understand what the brain waves actually mean. And then we can go back and see if there's any link between the brain waves and the psychological groups. And this would definitely, be very interesting data that people will be now looking at to actually find out what is going on really. Because if you give users surveys, we don't really know if that is really true information that a user has provided us with the surveys. But at least if we get an eye tracking data, if we get results from an eye tracker, or if we get results from an EEG device, there's no way that that information can lie, because it's coming directly from, where the user is looking at on the screen and what the user is actually thinking about. So great research ideas, I guess just more and more work that needs to be done in this field, and potentially bringing in interdisciplinary areas together, rather than, solely working on information systems and human-computer interaction on its own.
So if we use data from an eye tracker or from the EEG device, then what we're getting is objective evaluation of the interface from the user, rather than subjective perception, which we would usually get from interviews or completing the survey. So data would probably be more real or realistic if we use the EEG device and the eye tracking device to obtain evaluations of an interface.
This is really interesting for me. Well, this is a podcast, but even if this is a podcast, could you please attach or add a figure or even video capture that shows how the EEG works in this case?
So, so what I have here is a screenshot of what the brain waves would look like. So this is the output from an EEG device, and you would see that different brain waves associate with different feelings or emotions. And so we can now use these brain waves and output from an EEG to obtain information if the user is feeling angry about an interface or upset or disgusted with an interface, or on a positive note, if a user is feeling happy and contented while using a particular interface. So this is a snapshot from a paper in 2016. It is called Technological Basis of EEG Recording and Operational Apparatus. The first author is Abang Priyanka. So if you would like to know more, perhaps take a look at this paper or the other papers that start to look at EEG devices output. Each frequency band, so whether it is gamma, beta, alpha, theta, or delta, also have got a specific frequency associated to it. So the frequency of a particular band will dictate the state of a brain. So for example, under a delta frequency band between 0.5 to 4 hertz, that is the brain state where it is asleep. So psychologists or neuropsychologists or neuroscientists would be able to determine the frequency as well as the frequency band, and from then we can then measure different cognitive states or emotional states of a user when the user looks at an interface.
And how accurate is this methodology? I mean, these EEG frequencies, can one later, after a mathematical or computer analysis of these EEGs, can exactly determine, as you said before, whether the subject is content or sad or any other emotional state, and with which accuracy can this be done? And how accurate is this methodology? I mean, these EEG frequencies, can one later, after a mathematical or computer analysis of these EEGs, can exactly determine, as you said before, whether the subject is content or sad or any other emotional state, and with which accuracy can this be done?
So accuracy studies in relation to using EEG devices are quite new. They are very recent. So over the past 3 years, I see many research studies looking to evaluate or measure accuracy from data provided by EEG devices. But it appears that the trend seems to be going in the direction of using EEG with eye tracking data, so a combined measure of EEG results and eye tracking results. Accuracy almost reaches 90%, correctly predicting emotion and intention And eye movement data also uses not just heat maps and saccades. So that's where you look at the page first and for how long, and where do you look at next, and where do you look at next, and how much time do you spend at each of those points. But also looking at pupil dilation to determine and link that results together with EEG devices. So with all these measurements, we can never be 100% accurate, but reaching an accuracy level of 90% is pretty good, where we are able to use EEG data along with eye tracking data to determine if a user is getting frustrated or is he enjoying the search and using the interface. But these are definitely new technologies that provide us a lot richer data in comparison to going back to traditional methods of asking someone to fill up a survey about what they think about the interface, or even interviewing people um, after using an interface to see what they think of that interface.
And have you experienced using this system with yourself so that you can directly measure the accuracy with you? And what is your impression?
So I haven't done research studies where I check results for accuracy, but I think it certainly provides a new perspective where you conduct experiments with the user, you collect data from the eye tracker or the EEG, and then you go back to the user to confirm if their EEG results accurately predicted their emotional feeling or their cognitive experience from using the interface. Similarly, with the eye tracker, if we now have results from the heat map and results from the fixation points or saccades, we can now go back to individual users and perhaps ask them why were parts of the page not seen, or why was reading the text more important than looking at the picture. And similarly with the fixations or saccades, if we ask the user what drew your attention to that part of the page and not other parts of the page, that provides us with the what and why answers. So it gives a nice tie into the ability to explain results. So the results of the eye tracker and results of the EEG provide us with answers to what is the user feeling, or how is the user feeling, and where is the user looking at the page. Whereas, and when we go back and confirm results with the users, we then have answers to why. Why is the user looking at a particular image? Why is the user not looking at a particular image? Certainly would add a lot of value to our experiments and data, and explaining our data. Certainly would provide designers, HCI designers, content creators, a lot of information about how to go about designing better pages that are more friendly, user-friendly, and pages that are visually appealing.
And can you tell us a little bit about how are you developing this research? I mean, is this just your research group working on this, or do you have some international collaborators or national collaborators working in different parts of the project? Second question, how is your funding situation in this context? Is it enough for you to perform the studies, or are you applying to some research call in order to obtain more resources?
To answer your first question, my early research papers with the eye tracker was done with a collaborator from Brunel University in the UK, Professor Robert McCready. It was a very short collaboration, but one that was very fruitful and worthwhile. The second research project, where I looked at personality traits and HCI and provided an explanation, put people in different personality groups, and with that personality groups looked at which design elements on a screen would be able to increase trust values for people of certain personality traits. This project was done by a master's student. Now she has graduated and returned to her home country. She is currently working in the industry in a consulting field. But my next plan with the eye tracker was to use it from an education perspective. So the idea that I had in mind was I wanted to put up images of x-rays or scan of a broken bone or ECG results, so your heart rhythm results, on the eye tracker and invite medical students to have a look at those images and perform some kind of diagnosis of what was going on with the heart rhythms. Why could it be that way? If it was a normal heart rhythm or abnormal heart rhythm. Similarly, if you show medical students the x-ray of a broken femur, for example, I was keen to know if medical students were looking at the right places, were they ignoring other parts of the image which they should be paying attention to. So the heat maps and the saccades or the fixation points output from the eye tracker would certainly be able to provide us with that information. So I would then go to doctors who teach medical students or who work at university hospitals and show them that this is where your students are looking at, and this is where your students are not looking at. Do you want them to focus there? Is that where the problem is? Do you want them to be looking at other parts of the screen? So I see that there are two parties here that would benefit. One, we know with the results from the eye tracker where students are looking at, and we can then correct that in class or perform some kind of intervention in class. So when the doctor is then teaching medical students, the doctor then knows that students are more likely going to look at that part of the image and not the other part of the image. So perhaps then there needs to be an intervention where the medical doctor says something like, don't forget to look here because there is a connection between this and this. So this is an idea that I had in my head for a very long time, but I've never been able to roll it out. And I've never spoken to anyone about it. So everyone in this group now has the privilege of knowing what my future intentions are with the eye tracker. And I welcome feedback if you have any, to let me know what you think about this idea that I have in mind. Your second question with funding. So my early research studies with Robert McCready, that was done via, so I applied for seed funding from the School of Information Technology at Monash University. That was where I was at before, University of Canterbury. I was given $10,000 to complete that project. So most of the money went to hiring a research assistant to help with the data collection and run the experiment. And then the other part of the money went into giving participants a token or a voucher, a gift voucher, as a token of appreciation for taking the time and effort to come over to the university, sit and talk with us for 45 minutes and conduct the experiment. There will always be avenues to look for funding. I think the challenge here is finding the time to sit down, write a proposal and apply for the funding. I'm sure a lot of us in this group here are academics, so we teach and we also do research. And sometimes it's very difficult to balance between the two. So I haven't actually seriously looked at where to look for funding for my future projects. I thought I think it's important to get a group of people, to have a team of people together each of us with different areas of expertise who are able to contribute to a common goal or common aim. And then from there, put in a funding application. It might be better that way. That's just a personal opinion. So that those are just my 2 cents worth.
I think you comment a situation which is very important. You are developing very interesting ideas from one side, and then from the other side, as you say, one of course needs to have some funding in order to perform the research. For instance, you need a research assistant and the budget for the people that participate in the studies. So at the end, one needs to have some funding finally in order to perform the studies. Yeah, I think for the idea that you suggest, it's very interesting. But the problem I see here is, of course, again, to get funding, which, as you say, is kind of a common problem for all the people that are in this community and many other places. Of course, when you are an academic, then you need to kind of divide your time between teaching, research, and so on and so forth, and then it can be very difficult or even impossible to apply just one, just you or just me, to apply for a big grant, because it's a lot of work. Okay, so from my experience and related to the situation where you suggest to collaborate with another people with a common goal, I will look for consortia of different people that are needed to participate in a big grant. Yeah, I don't know how this works in Australia. I have no idea, but I can tell you in Europe there is the Horizon program that fosters exactly this kind of research grants, where you need different people, different groups for different European countries, and there is one coordinator which coordinates the grant application, and this one needs to do a lot of work in order to coordinate, of course. But the other partners usually it's usually required less effort from them in order to prepare the grant. Well, I know it by heart because I'm coordinating one of these grants now, and it's a lot of work. Anyway, so from my experience in the past, I have participated in a grant which was about to receive funding from Europe, Japan, and Australia. I can send you the details later, but it's kind of a research program in cooperation with Europe, Japan, and Australia. I don't know if this program is still active, okay? But I will look for opportunities like this, perhaps, because if there is a good coordinator, then one needs to do, of course, some work in order to prepare the grant application, but usually less than if you go just yourself and prepare all the documentation and so on and so forth. So I will look for it. Perhaps I even wonder if, that's one of my questions, do you have at your university some kind of support service for grant applications? This service where you go with some idea and they look for grant calls in Australia or elsewhere, and they can even help you with prepare all the paperwork and so on and so forth. I'm very curious to know if this service exists at the university. I guess yes, but wanted to know about it. Thanks. I think you comment a situation which is very important. You are developing very interesting ideas from one side, and then from the other side, as you say, one of course needs to have some funding in order to perform the research. For instance, you need a research assistant and the budget for the people that participate in the studies. So at the end, one needs to have some funding finally in order to perform the studies. Yeah, I think for the idea that you suggest, it's very interesting. But the problem I see here is, of course, again, to get funding, which, as you say, is kind of a common problem for all the people that are in this community and many other places. Of course, when you are an academic, then you need to kind of divide your time between teaching, research, and so on and so forth, and then it can be very difficult or even impossible to apply just one, just you or just me, to apply for a big grant, because it's a lot of work. Okay, so from my experience and related to the situation where you suggest to collaborate with another people with a common goal, I will look for consortia of different people that are needed to participate in a big grant. Yeah, I don't know how this works in Australia. I have no idea, but I can tell you in Europe there is the Horizon program that fosters exactly this kind of research grants, where you need different people, different groups for different European countries, and there is one coordinator which coordinates the grant application, and this one needs to do a lot of work in order to coordinate, of course. But the other partners usually it's usually required less effort from them in order to prepare the grant. Well, I know it by heart because I'm coordinating one of these grants now, and it's a lot of work. Anyway, so from my experience in the past, I have participated in a grant which was about to receive funding from Europe, Japan, and Australia. I can send you the details later, but it's kind of a research program in cooperation with Europe, Japan, and Australia. I don't know if this program is still active, okay? But I will look for opportunities like this, perhaps, because if there is a good coordinator, then one needs to do, of course, some work in order to prepare the grant application, but usually less than if you go just yourself and prepare all the documentation and so on and so forth. So I will look for it. Perhaps I even wonder if, that's one of my questions, do you have at your university some kind of support service for grant applications? This service where you go with some idea and they look for grant calls in Australia or elsewhere, and they can even help you with prepare all the paperwork and so on and so forth. I'm very curious to know if this service exists at the university. I guess yes, but wanted to know about it. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that piece of information. I'll be happy to look at that link when you find it for the consortium. So my first experience applying for a grant was where I took on the role of the primary investigator, and I had 4 other people on the grant as associate investigators. And with this grant, we were looking at how physicians and doctors perform online, a particular type of online searching called evidence-based medicine. So I was the IS person in the grant. I had a physician who was a neonatal ICU specialist, and that was where we conducted the research study, teaching hospitals in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and specifically at the neonatal ICU unit. So we followed doctors during their morning rounds to see how was information searching done, what were they looking for, what sources were they looking up, and the reading behavior. Were they looking at the entire research article, or were they only looking at the abstract? And we were also able to compare searching patterns between
medical students and physicians and comment on the differences in such behavior. With that grant, because I was the primary investigator, the other named investigators on the grant were supporting me. So, for example, they would be liaising with the hospitals to obtain permission, introduce me to the hospital, do a little bit of introduction and buy-in for the research project. The other investigator was a professor in health economics. So he provided insight from a health economics perspective. How do we use this data to improve health outcomes, reduce infant mortality rates, for example. So with my first experience with the grant, I had to do a lot of the work. There wasn't a coordinator as such. I think the primary investigator takes on the role of the coordinator and the main person for the grant. In New Zealand, I recently applied for a government grant, and I also took up the role as a primary investigator. So a lot of the work and the coordination, well, I guess needed to be done by the PI. So this concept which you have just explained about using the coordinator to handle and manage the project is quite interesting. Is the coordinator also a primary investigator? I wonder if the terms are interchangeable. Is it called coordinator on certain grants and then primary investigator on others? While the grant which I received from the Malaysian government allowed me to use funding to enroll a PhD student on a program. So part of the money from the grant would go to paying the PhD student stipend. And in return, the university would award the student a scholarship. So the student wouldn't need to pay tuition fees and receive stipend from the grant. I could also use the money in the grant to pay for purchasing of hardware and software, and also travel purposes for conferences, registration for conference, and if we were going to publish in a journal, then if the journal required some kind of processing fee or payment fee, then we would be able to use the funding from there. But I've also realized that funding agencies work differently across different countries. So the grant that I applied for in New Zealand, another which is a government grant, allowed buyout for time, which meant that the grant would now pay a certain portion of my salary, which I found quite interesting because I think money is not only used to run the project. I think it's nice to also use the money from the grant to buy out the researcher's time, which meant that the researcher could focus 100% on doing the work for the research project rather than trying to balance work with the research project, with teaching, and with services, which are typical activities performed by academics working in the university. And the question about support. So the support that I received while in Malaysia was that so the research office would publicize these grants, provide you with dates, provide you with samples of successful grants if you needed to have a look at what those look like. And they were able to support you in terms of reviewing the grant, providing you with feedback, providing you with comments to improve the grant. So they would send a potential application for a grant to somebody who is an experienced primary investigator, an experienced researcher or professor, and then they would send that comments and feedback to you. I found that process quite useful where you get your grant evaluated by an expert in that area, and you get comments from them, and you improve the grant, hoping that the grant will become a successful grant where you will receive funding from the grant from the government agency. But I've also realized that in some universities in New Zealand, that money from the grant is also used for overheads. So there are certain departments within the university that will take 5% or 10%, I'm not sure what the exact number is, of the grant for their departments. For example, the research department or the research group within the university takes 3% of overheads, and that then is shared between the finance department and various other departments. So I'm not very clear about who exactly gets the administration fees and why they need to get administration fees when the real work is actually done by the researchers and the named researchers. But I found that some universities in New Zealand charge overhead, so they take a certain amount of money from the grant, which then reduces the amount of money that the researcher actually has. And sometimes some successful grant recipients argue the need for having overheads in the first place because they don't contribute to the grant. They're not directly assisting you in any way, but yet they get some percentage of the grant. So it had two different experiences, and I think you probably learn along the way of what the grant process is. I think writing a grant is already a challenge on its own, and then if there are 2 rounds or several rounds that you need to get through in order for a grant to be successful, that adds to the workload. And then I think once you have a successful grant, managing that grant with the administration issues, with the research issues, and with the funding presents itself with a different set of problems. So I think the PI or the coordinator, really needs to be somebody who's very good with project management in all aspects, and can call upon the other named investigators or the associate investigators to assist. But we all know as a grant recipient, there are also expected outcomes and outputs, and that is, the next hurdle for you to produce research papers, or to have a PhD student conduct the research and have the PhD student graduate. Because at the end of the day, getting a grant is one thing, and then completing the grant successfully is another outcome altogether. And I think we all know the research community or the academic community is one that is small. And so if you don't manage the grant properly, or there are issues, then there's a high chance of you probably not getting the next grant that you want to apply for. So, you have to manage, you have to have a vast set of skills, whether it is soft skills, dealing with people, or managing timelines, or managing backup procedures in case what you plan to do doesn't work out well. So I found that to be quite an interesting experience, having had managed one grant and completing it successfully. Well, if I'm successful with the second grant, I'm sure I will also learn from that whole experience. And I suppose this is what differentiates academics. So somebody who hasn't applied or received a successful grant versus someone who has. And I think you would go on to, when you become an experienced primary investigator or a successful research grant applicant, then I guess you can then use that experience to help the junior academic staff or mentor them in relation to how would you apply for grants, what are the processes that take place. So I think sometimes we get all these questions. What is a good title? What do I need to do? Or what projects do I need to run so that I can guarantee that the grant is successful? I think there's no secret recipe. There are a whole host of different factors that will make one applicant successful and the other not, or make one research project successful and the other one not. So I think we all know what the checklist is, and we try to tick off as many boxes as we can in the checklist, and at the end of the day, it sometimes just boils down to luck.
Thanks, Anushia. You provided a very detailed answer, explanation, and I think even it could be said that even you provided a great research grants class for the people that don't know what the thing is about. So thanks a lot for all the details and sharing your experiences. Okay, first I would like to comment. I think you asked if in these European consortiums I have participated, if there are differences between the principal investigator and the coordinator. Well, just let me summarize it very, very briefly. Okay, in this kind of consortium, there are usually many different partners. On average, you can say there are 8 partners from different European countries, usually. And from each partner, you need to designate a principal investigator who will coordinate the communication between each partner and the main coordinator of the whole project. Okay, so you have 9 partners or 8 partners, then you will have at least 9 principal investigators. And then in addition, one of the partners will coordinate the whole project. And usually, he or she is called the main project coordinator. And is he or she called principal investigator or not? Well, I think in this context, it doesn't matter, because in all the paperwork, in all the administration, he or she is always called the main coordinator. The requirements to be main coordinator, sometimes you don't even need to hold a PhD. There are some cases for people that have a lot of experience, and if they can justify this experience, they can show that they can coordinate such projects. For instance, people that have been working on consultancy companies for quite a long time can coordinate such big projects, but it is usually somebody which works as a principal investigator at the university or research center, and which applies coordinating the whole consortium. I don't know if this answers your question or not. Otherwise, just let me know. Yeah, there is another thing you commented about the indirect costs. This is always kind of a tricky thing. Yeah, you said that in New Zealand it's about, 5%, 10%. Here in Europe, in Spain, it depends on the funding agency, but usually the justification is that the research center or the university gets those indirect costs in order to pay for the research infrastructures that are used on the project, which could make sense. Yeah, but of course I agree with you in the sense that at the end of the day, are the researchers the ones that perform most of the work, the application, the submission, the follow-up, making the project, finishing the project, and the work that they perform in administration, it can be usually not very not rocket science. Okay, yeah, And then at the end of your message, you commented that, yeah, of course, you can prepare a very good grant application. You can try to tick most of the boxes. You can try to make a really great work. But at the end, I think there is not much money, and the funding agencies receive really a lot of research grant proposals. There's no money for everybody, so they need to prioritize. And sometimes, I don't know, they throw a dice or they toss a coin or something like that, and at the end it's just luck. Okay, but of course, from experience, you need to craft a really good research proposal. Otherwise, you will be not successful at all. And lastly, one of the things that you commented, I think it's one of the most important things in the research grants world, which is, okay, you get a research grant. Okay, good, great. You did a lot of work, right? But then the project starts. And then you need to make kind of the work that you said you would do. And sometimes this is the most complicated part, at least for me. And even more from my experience, if you are in a coordinated project. I mean, if you coordinate your project, or I don't know, it's a grant in which you are the only partner, it could be complicated or not, but there will be problems, of course, a lot of problems, I don't know, with the people you hire, with infrastructures that you use. They get broken, or a lot of problems. So at the end of the day, you spend most of the time with small fires, a lot of those fires, but it's usually kind of a lot of work. But in coordinated projects, it's even more complicated, because sometimes it's not only the things that you don't do, but the things that other people don't do, and that you know that they will not do. Okay, it's like having kids that don't want to eat anything for dinner or something like that, and yeah, it's sometimes very frustrating, these kind of situations, because you even know that they got the money, they got a lot of money, they are doing nothing about the project, and you are the main, or you are the one that needs to justify all the money from all the project to the research agency, at least in European projects. So yeah, this is very interesting experience. But yeah, I wonder if this question you asked me about the difference between principal investigator and coordinator was clear.
Thank you, Horatio, for answering the question. It's now clear what the coordinator's role is and the primary investigator, principal investigator's role is when working around the consortium method of applying for grants. Also, thank you for sharing your experience with managing the grants. Yes, I agree. It's full of unpredictable situations and occasions, and it could be something as simple as perhaps maybe budgeting some money to buy software, and you've made a decision that you don't want to buy the software, but perhaps that money now can be used to buy a new piece of hardware. And sometimes it's not so clear whether this is allowed or not allowed, and time is wasted by going through the process of checking through various people from the finance department in the university to the grant agency. So yeah, acknowledged, full of challenges and issues, but as academics, there is really no other way. You will at some point of your life have to apply for it, and then when all the boxes are ticked, and if the coin rolls and your project is a coin is tossed and your project is selected, then you will have to manage it, because you can't run away from not I'm doing it. This is just the way the world works in academia. So thank you so much for that.
Welcome. Okay, so we have talked a lot about your research area, the way grants can be managed, how do you do it, your experience with grants, and so on. So, since in this podcast we talk not just about the research, but also about how researchers made their research, my next question would be, how do you prefer to prepare a day of your research work? And same question if we scale up about how you prepare your work for, I don't know, for one semester, 1 year, or in a scale of 5 years if you do it. I mean, not about teaching purposes, but just about research purposes. Thanks.
Oh, this is an interesting question. I've actually never thought about how I actually plan my research. Everything seems to either fall in place or I manage it as short-term strategies. But the way I teach influences the way I do research. I do a lot of teaching in the first semester of the year, so between February and June. And I don't do teaching or do very little teaching, so maybe just 2 hours a week in semester 2 of the year, so July up to November. So I tend to do a lot of my research in semester 2, and it's quite hard to actually do any kind of research in semester 1 unless the data has already been analyzed and I am writing a paper. But the progress is very slow in semester 1 because trying to balance writing a paper and also teaching and all the other activities that come along with the teaching. I've never actually planned my research agenda for anything more than a year unless I am working on a grant. Then I have a clear plan over the next 3 or 4 years. But other than that, research is always on my mind, and I'm trying to do some kind of research activity, and it could be interviewing participants, collecting data, or writing a small paragraph. So in the next few months, I have a couple of conferences coming up, which are relevant to my field. So I will start working on them for writing because the data is ready and the data has already been analyzed. So I'll just need to put that into paper and write. And from last year, I collected a lot of data, and those data have yet to be analyzed. And so as my teaching winds down, I will then start analyzing the data and then writing research papers for that data. So that's usually how I plan the year. I know what I have to put in paper, and I know what data is remaining, and then I will just try and forecast how do I get the time and where do I get the time to actually start analyzing the data that's there and then translating that into a paper. So I don't plan very far. At most, it is just a year. And that's how I have been doing it over several years. Seems to be working okay as a strategy, but I'd love to hear how other people plan for their research as well. So thank you for that question.
Thanks for the clarification. Yes, I think that, well, from my point of view, it's quite hard to keep up with research and teaching at the same time. That's really complicated. My next question would be, how do you plan writing a paper? I mean, which process do you use, which tools, overall, how do you do it? Thanks.
So the plan is if I want to target a conference, then I will manage my time based on the conference due date. But if I'm not targeting a conference, then I will look at the data that I have. So
if I've already analyzed the data and it's a matter of putting words to paper, then I do it that way and then start sending off to journal papers. So it really depends on whether I want to send a piece of the manuscript, if I want to send it to a conference or a journal, and then I use, if it's to a conference, then I use the deadlines to help plan a paper before the submission date. If I'm not targeting a conference, then I will look at the data and see which papers or which projects is most complete, and then try and convert that to a paper and send it off to a journal.
And do you use some specific criteria in order to choosing conferences, kind of distance or core ranking or any other data?
I use core for conferences, and then for journals I use ABDC, so that's the Australian Business Deans Council list. Also, there are some IS journals in a ranking called FT20. So FT50 journalists. So I definitely try to publish at the higher ranking conferences and journals. We also use Simago. So if it's Simago, then a Q1 or Q2 journal. And then if it's core or ABDC, then it is an A or A star. Otherwise, B. So I definitely target conferences based on their rankings. But because my field is in information search and retrieval, relatively new field, many conferences don't actually have a track specific for information retrieval. And sometimes there are specific information retrieval conferences like CHIR, so that's CHIIR, and that stands for the ACM CIR Conference for Human Information Interaction and Retrieval.
Okay, listening to this, I remember that about something I did in the past. There were some quite big conferences, and my kind of very narrow research area is structural bioinformatics and high performance computing. It's something quite specific. So I also wanted to go to conferences on this area, but at least in Europe, there were not many. So what I decided is to contact the biggest conferences or the medium conferences and ask them if they would be interested so that I would organize a track on that research area, very specific for that conference. And most of the times they said no, because this is quite new or this is very specific and so on and so forth, and nobody will attend to this track. But then what I did, I kind of contact some people. I got the confirmation they would attend the conference, and with some numbers, I contact them again, and then they did agree, and I could organize it. Of course, it's a lot of work, really, a lot of work, and I don't think at the moment I will do it again. But that's what I did in order to have conferences where I organize the track, but then I can submit some paper, which of course will not be reviewed by me or anybody close to me, of course. But at least it was a way to have more peers working on the same subject. I don't know if you have ever tried something similar or if you wanted to do it.
Thank you for sharing. I actually had a similar idea in my mind that I will contact potential program chairs or conference chairs and ask if they are happy for me to introduce a new track. But I know it will be a lot of work. So at this point of time, it hasn't become an urgent need as yet. I can still send my conference papers elsewhere. So I haven't actually looked at the possible solution of introducing a new track on these main conferences. But maybe the time will come in the near future or in the far future when I feel I am established, a researcher in the area of information search and retrieval. And then maybe in the next 3 or 4 years, I might start introducing an information search and retrieval track in the information systems conferences. So maybe I will do this in the next few years, who knows? But at this point of time, my focus is still to do my research and to get the research out there and establish myself as a researcher first. So thank you for sharing that story with me. I'll probably use that story to motivate me in the next few years to start introducing information search and retrieval as a track in major IS conferences.
And I also wanted to ask you about your impression or opinion about filing preprints before submitting your work to either conferences or journals. Yeah, I'm very curious about what you would think, because I have asked many people from very different areas and there's not a common ground. Some people think this is a waste of time. Some people think it can go against the journal requirements. Some other people say, hey, let's go first to the preprint, because sometimes the review processing time can take ages, months even. So why not filing preprint first, so that readers can get information about your work instantly? So yeah, wanted to know what you think about this. Thanks.
Thank you for your question, Horacio. I'm not really sure where I stand with the preprint. On one hand, if you allow for preprints, it allows people to see your work and view your work, but they're not able to cite it yet, right? If I'm not wrong, because the journal hasn't accepted it. So it provides you an insight, I guess, if you like, to work that you have done, which has yet to be accepted. On the other hand, you can't really cite preprints, but it gives you an idea of what other people are doing. That's really pretty much it. But then the other question that I have is if you allow for preprints, then the journal doesn't accept the paper for whatever reason. Then what happens? Does somebody then now get to duplicate your work or do something similar or enhance on your work? So not. I'm pretty much on the fence here on this one. I'm not really sure whether I would advocate towards preprints or not using preprints. So I really don't know. If this is my personal choice, I would probably say no to preprints. Let the journal process take its course, and then see what happens at the end of the day. If it gets accepted, that's great. But then we also know there's a time between journal accepting something and paper actually being available, made available. So maybe in that stage, preprints would make sense when you know the journal has accepted a work, but it's not yet published. So I think preprints at that stage makes a lot of sense, because then somebody can cite your work and they also get a view of what you're doing. But I think preprints during the review process before a journal gets accepted probably in my opinion, not very useful.
Yes, I understand your point of view, and I think it depends on personal choices, preferences, and things like that. Okay. From a point of view, well, first let me ask you your questions. You ask if preprints can be cited. The answer is mostly yes. Yes. Okay. If you file or deposit your preprint in the most common preprint servers like Archive or things like that, you can see examples in the literature where people cite them, and it's not a problem at all. Second question, will be a problem for the journal if the work has been previously filed as a preprint? The answer is it depends. It depends. I mean, one should check first the author guidelines of the journal you want to submit to. And there you can find the guidelines. Because most journals have no problem with this, but some, let's say, few of them might have problems. And you can clearly read it on their author guidelines. So then, before filing the preprint, I would check them, okay? And yeah, second thing is, even if the journal accepts that you have filed before the preprint, of course, when you send the manuscript to the journal, in the cover letter or somewhere else, because it depends on the submission system, you should indicate that you have previously filed as preprint, and no problem. I have done it many times, and no problem at all, okay? And third question, from my experience, and I can only talk from my experience, and from what I have seen, it's pretty uncommon that people send manuscript to the journal, the manuscript, let's say it's accepted, and when it is accepted, people file the preprint. I have not seen things like that. It doesn't mean, of course, that they don't exist, but from my experience, it's something kind of unusual, okay? And yeah, and last thing is, of course, you file the preprint, then you submit to the journal, and when the manuscript is accepted in the journal, you usually indicate in the preprint that the final version, the accepted version in the journal is, and you indicate the link in order to show that there are not two different publications. One is the preprint and the other one is the journal publication. Okay, so just let me know if I answer your questions, but at the end of the day, it's kind of a personal choice.
Thank you, Horacio, for your very clear and detailed explanation. I now know better about preprints, and perhaps maybe my next manuscript that I send, I would probably look at the guidelines and perhaps allow for preprint to be available. It seems wise, I think, in my opinion, to perhaps have a preprint available somewhere so that your research is now out there for people to look, see, read, and cite.
Bueno, aquí termina este episodio realizado en nuestra comunidad de investigadores en WhatsApp, la comunidad a la que puedes acceder de manera gratuita, al menos de momento, y que puedes encontrar en horacio-ps.com/comunidad. Si te interesa participar en uno de estos episodios, eres totalmente libre de acceder y proponer y contar tu investigación para que los demás se interesen y surja un diálogo súper interesante. Espero que te haya resultado interesante el episodio de hoy. Como ves, se han tratado muy diferentes temas. Hemos tenido la opinión directa de su trabajo, nos lo ha contado Anushia cómo investiga, y también sus opiniones de diferentes procesos relacionados con el mundo de investigación, la captación de fondos, los sistemas de publicación y un largo etcétera de diferentes aspectos. Bueno, pues nada más. Espero que tengas una jornada muy interesante y hasta luego.